In 2016, a young woman set off on what was meant to be the adventure of a lifetime, but instead it turned into a nightmare no one saw coming. The authorities she counted on offered little help, leaving her family desperate for answers. What should have been a simple truth became tangled in contradictions, silence, and outright cover-ups. Every new piece of evidence raised even more troubling questions. This is the case of Ellie Rose Warren, and to this day, it remains unresolved. Ellie Rose Warren was born on June the 24th, 1996, in Melbourne, Australia. To her parents, Paul and Nicole Warren, she grew up in Mulek, a coastal suburb where she was surrounded by love, adventure, and a deep appreciation for the world beyond her doorstep. The Warren family travelled often, both within Australia and internationally, fueling Ellie's passion for exploration. A trip to Africa in 2012, when she was just 15, left a lasting impression on her. She was captivated by the continent's breathtaking landscapes, its people, and its wildlife. That experience shaped her future, planting the seed for a lifelong dream of travelling and working with animals. After returning home, Ellie became even more determined to explore different parts of the world. After finishing high school, she worked various jobs to fund her travels. Over the next few years, she visited Central America, Belize, Thailand, and several other countries, balancing her love for adventure with her ambition. Ellie was incredibly bright and had secured a place at James Cook University in Queensland to study marine biology. It was a career path that would allow her to work closely with the ocean and its creatures while continuing to travel. But before starting university, she wanted one last adventure, a meaningful trip back to Africa. At 20 years old, she signed up for a 6-week volunteer program in Mozambique with a marine research group called Africa Underwater. This organisation brought in volunteers to help marine biologists study coral reefs off the coast. Ellie was doing exactly what she had dreamed of, but her journey would be cut tragically short. She boarded a flight to Mozambique, but she never made it home. Before leaving for Africa, Ellie confided in her father that she felt unsure about the trip. She admitted she was nervous and questioned whether she should go, saying she had concerns about the country's safety. But Ellie was no stranger to travelling in unfamiliar places, and in the end, her excitement outweighed her fears. In September 2016, she arrived in Mozambique, where she stayed at Casa Barry Lodge in the lively coastal town of Tofo. Known for its laid-back atmosphere and reputation as a relatively safe spot for tourists, Tofo seemed like the perfect setting for her adventure. Each day, she was out in the Indian Ocean, studying marine life and soaking in the experience. It was everything she had hoped for. Along the way, she formed a close friendship with another volunteer named Joya, who later described Ellie as warm, full of energy, and deeply dedicated to her work. Tofo wasn't known for an intense party scene, but volunteers and tourists would often gather for drinks in the evenings. On one of those nights, not long before her trip was set to end, Ellie got into an argument with another person at Casa Barry. The result? She was banned from drinking while staying at the lodge. Rather than letting it get her down, Ellie saw it as a chance to wrap up her time at Casa Barry and spend a few extra days exploring the area on her own. After some time away, she returned to Tofo on November 8th to say goodbye to her friends before heading back to Australia to begin her studies. Her plan was to check into a hostel for the night, but first she wanted to see her friends one last time. Around 6:30 p.m, she arrived at Casa Barry, where she met up with Joya, Jade and the others. It was meant to be a final night of laughter and goodbyes, but it would become the last time anyone saw Ellie alive. Ellie had just arrived in the city, her bags still in tow, eager to spend one last evening with the friends she had made. She had accepted the alcohol ban at Casa Barry without complaint. The last known photo of Ellie captures a quiet moment. She sits on the balcony, a bottle of water in front of her while her friends sip on alcohol. As the evening unfolded and the energy picked up, the group decided to move on to their usual spot, a place called Victor's Bar, located near the local marketplace. Before joining them, Ellie made a quick stop at her hostel to drop off her belongings, freshen up and change her clothes. Once ready, she headed out again, stepping into the warm Mozambican night, unaware that this would be the last time she would be seen safe. As the night progressed, Ellie was seen drinking very little. A friend recalled that she had only one beer before they all made their way to a local's house, where they had been invited for a small gathering. There she had a single cocktail and seemed content, likely not drinking anything more. After about an hour, Ellie expressed that she wanted to return to Victor's bar. The rest of the group wasn't quite ready to leave yet, so she decided to go back on her own. Not long after, her friends eventually made their way back to the bar as well, where they were met with an unsettling update. Some fellow expats told them that Ellie had already come looking for them, but in the sea of people filling the bar that night, they had somehow missed each other. Assuming she would turn up again, they took their drinks and sat on the beach, waiting for her. Sure enough, at around 11 p.m, Ellie appeared, walking towards them with a smile. "I was just looking for you guys," she said, her usual upbeat self. She didn't seem drunk, and nothing appeared out of place. After a short exchange, Ellie went back inside the bar, saying she wanted to grab another beer before rejoining them. They stayed put, expecting her to return in a few minutes, but she never did. Time passed and Ellie was nowhere to be seen. By around 11:30 p.m, the group decided to call it a night and head back to their accommodations, unaware that Ellie was missing. As dawn broke over the coastal town, the usual morning rhythms began, fishermen setting out for their day, vendors preparing for the marketplace crowd. One of these early risers, a local fisherman, made his way towards the market. As he walked past a small toilet block near the market's edge, something unusual caught his eye. Against the muted tones of the sand, he noticed something pale. Curiosity gave way to dread as he moved closer. Lying face down in the dirt was a young woman. His steps slowed, the weight of what he was seeing sinking in. Realizing the severity of the situation, he immediately called for emergency services. Within moments, the quiet morning was disrupted by the arrival of police, and word spread quickly through the village. Residents gathered, whispering in hushed voices, trying to understand what had happened. The woman on the ground was Ellie Warren. She was unresponsive, her body still, her presence now just an echo of the vibrant young traveller she had been. Reports described her position. Face pressed against the earth, lower body partially exposed, with signs of injury around her neck and mouth. It was a devastating scene, one that raised more questions than answers. An investigation was launched immediately. The last reported sighting of Ellie came from Raphael, a security guard at Hotel Tofo. He told investigators that he had seen her at around 2 a.m. on November the 9th, walking in the direction of her hostel. This was unusual behaviour for Ellie. She wasn't the type to wander off alone or stay out late without letting her friends know. According to Raphael, she seemed highly intoxicated. Moments later, he saw her again, this time heading back toward the marketplace area instead of her accommodation. Why she changed direction remains unclear. Authorities from the Mozambique Criminal Investigation Unit arrived at the scene, blocking off the area as they started their inspection. Back in Australia, Ellie's family received the news that would forever alter their world. This is where things take a deeply unsettling turn. In the immediate aftermath of Ellie's death in November 2016, a police spokesperson stated that her passing was sudden and unexplained, with no clear signs of violence or assault. An autopsy was conducted in Mozambique on November the 9th, 2016. The findings suggested that Ellie had died from asphyxiation due to inhaling sand. The report indicated that she had fallen face first into the sand, which led to her suffocation. There were no significant external injuries or visible trauma, but what caused her to collapse in the first place remained unclear. Hoping to find answers, the Australian government sent a man named Blake Gray to Tofo to gather information. Blake spoke with several locals, including the fisherman who had discovered Ellie's body. This man had taken a photograph of the scene, but he wasn't able to share it electronically. Instead, Blake took a photo of the original image using his own camera, making it blurry but still usable for reference. Blake also spoke with a local diver named Steve, who worked at Peri Peri Divers. Steve was one of the first to arrive at the scene after Ellie was found, and was responsible for initially identifying her. He expressed strong doubts about the official reports, stating that he did not believe this was a tragic accident. What stood out to him was the way the sand was packed into Ellie's mouth. It wasn't loosely present as one might expect in an accidental fall. Instead, it was forced in, compressed in a way that suggested someone had deliberately stuffed her mouth with sand and pressed down. On November 16, 2016, Ellie's body was transferred to South Africa, where another autopsy was performed. The findings were consistent with the Mozambican report. She had died from asphyxiation due to inhaling sand. However, this time, the examination revealed a disturbing new detail. Ellie had inhaled a large quantity of sand while she was still alive, and it had been packed so tightly into her airways that it had the consistency of concrete. This suggested a deliberate act rather than an accidental fall. The force needed to push that much sand into her esophagus was not something that could have happened naturally. A toxicology report was also completed, which confirmed that there were no illegal substances in her system. All evidence pointed to Ellie being forcibly suffocated with sand, yet the exact circumstances remained a mystery. No one could definitively say whether this was a murder, even though everything pointed in that direction. As if the case wasn't complicated enough, an Australian Federal Police investigator named N.L. Scruton travelled to Tofo to further examine the crime scene and Ellie's remains. He collected sand samples from the marketplace and the toilet block near where Ellie was found. The next day, he travelled to South Africa to inspect her body. What he discovered changed everything. The sand he had gathered from the crime scene did not match the sand found in Ellie's mouth and lungs. This was a major breakthrough. It meant that Ellie had not simply collapsed where she was found. Instead, she had been suffocated with sand from a different location and then moved. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a horrifying intentional act. On November 22, 2016, Ellie's body was repatriated to Australia, where a third autopsy was conducted. Again, sand was found in her airways. But despite all the mounting evidence, the Australian report ultimately concluded that there was not enough proof to declare her death a homicide. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, leaving the case in a frustrating limbo. There was overwhelming evidence suggesting Ellie had been murdered, but no official autopsy report was willing to make that declaration. During this time, Ellie's family grew increasingly frustrated. They felt that both the Australian Federal Police and Mozambican authorities were not doing enough to investigate the truth. On November the 25th, a clear photograph of the crime scene, one that the fisherman had taken, was finally sent to the Australian authorities. This image provided even more evidence of a violent struggle. It clearly showed Ellie's torn clothing, as well as cuts and bruises on her body. Despite having access to this crucial evidence, the Australian authorities chose to wait for Mozambique's report, rather than taking independent action or assisting with the investigation. The Warren family was left in the dark, never fully informed about the damning evidence that strongly suggested Ellie had been violently attacked before her death. And now comes the part that is especially frustrating. In the months following Ellie's death, the Mozambique police continued their investigation. But it wasn't until April 2017, 6 months later, that they finally sent the Australian authorities their first formal report. This report, spanning only 2 pages, concluded that Ellie had died from a drug overdose. This claim directly contradicted the toxicology report, which had already confirmed that no substances were found in her system that could have led to an overdose. The Australian authorities assumed this must have been an error and asked for a revised report. Just 4 days later, on April 20th, a second report arrived, this time stating that her death could have been a homicide. The inconsistency between these 2 reports raised serious concerns about the credibility of the Mozambique authorities. How could such a major contradiction occur? Why would the initial report completely disregard their own autopsy findings, forensic analysis, and crime scene photographs? It left many questioning whether they were attempting to mislead the Australian government and quietly close the case. The Warren family was outraged, refusing to accept such glaring contradictions, but their battle for answers was far from over. Despite receiving both reports, the Australian Federal Police failed to take any meaningful action. Even after being informed that Ellie's death might have been a homicide, they did not initiate further steps to investigate. There was a formal process in place, known as a mutual assistance request, which would have allowed Australian authorities to provide direct assistance with the case. Yet, for reasons unknown, this request was never sent. The Warren family became increasingly convinced that the Australian government was not taking Ellie's case seriously. If her death was now being considered a possible murder, why was there no movement from law enforcement? Ellie's father, Paul Warren, started to believe that authorities, both in Mozambique and in Australia, wanted the case to quietly fade away. But Paul had no intention of letting that happen. Determined to uncover the truth, he began his own investigation. In August 2017, an Australian detective travelled to Mozambique in an effort to gather evidence. One of the key pieces of evidence they sought was crime scene photographs. However, the Australian authorities had already been given a clear image from the fisherman who had discovered Ellie's body. When the detective formally requested additional images from the Mozambique police, they claimed the photographs were stored on a broken mobile phone. In response, the detective provided local currency to repair the phone and recover the images. Yet, despite this effort, the photographs were never officially handed over. This missing evidence would later prove to be a crucial piece of the puzzle. Realising that the investigation had stalled, Paul Warren decided to take matters into his own hands. In October 2018, he travelled to Mozambique himself, retracing his daughter's final movements in a desperate attempt to find the truth. He put up posters throughout Tofo, pleading with locals to come forward with any information they had. It didn't take long. Within just 2 days, he was approached by a local man who had a high-quality photograph of Ellie's body taken shortly after she was found. This image revealed details that had never been disclosed to the Warren family. Ellie's blouse had been torn from the shoulder all the way down her right side, strongly suggesting she had been in a violent struggle. Paul also spoke with 2 locals who had been near the scene shortly after Ellie's body was discovered, and what they told him exposed even more troubling inconsistencies. The 2 men who had been near the scene described something troubling. They recalled seeing Ellie's body positioned differently from the way it appeared in the fisherman's photograph. According to them, she had been discovered leaning forward, her face pressed against the ground in a posture that resembled prayer. Yet the crime scene photo taken by the fisherman showed her body lying flat. This raised an unsettling possibility. Had someone moved her after she was found? If so, was it an attempt to stage the scene? Paul couldn't shake the feeling that the authorities were involved in a cover-up. Determined to get answers, he arranged a meeting with the officer in charge of Ellie's case in Tofo. What he heard next shocked him. The officer admitted that Ellie had likely been killed somewhere else and then transported to the toilet block where she was found. He pointed out that the sand in her mouth was different from the sand at the scene, reinforcing what DS Scruton had already concluded, that she had been forced to inhale it in another location. This single statement directly contradicted years of official reports, which had consistently claimed that the toilet block was where the crime took place. If the Australian authorities had known about this but failed to tell the Warren family, what else had they chosen to ignore? Frustrated and furious, Paul demanded answers. When his emails went unanswered, he took things a step further. He started copying government officials into his messages, leaving them no choice but to respond. It wasn't until March of 20 that the Australian Federal Police finally replied. But instead of addressing Paul's concerns, they warned him to stop sending mass emails, claiming it could interfere with diplomatic relations. To Paul, this wasn't just a brush-off. It confirmed his worst fears. The Australian authorities weren't interested in pursuing justice. They wanted this case to disappear. But Paul refused to let that happen. Then, in March of 21, a new lead emerged. A woman who had recently visited Tofo reached out with an alarming story. She said that locals spoke in hushed tones about a man named Tony, someone with influence in the area's drug trade and criminal underworld. Her children had overheard a conversation in which Tony was accused of playing a role in Ellie's death. She described him as a man covered in tattoos, including a teardrop under one eye, and warned that he was feared by many. Determined to follow this lead, Paul partnered with a German private investigator known as Mad Mick. Together, they devised a plan to get close to Tony. They hired a woman to infiltrate his circle, hoping to gain his trust and extract a confession. Over the course of several weeks, she recorded numerous conversations. Although none of them directly mentioned Ellie, she sensed that Tony was hiding something. As time passed, her fear grew. Tony was unpredictable, watching those around him closely. The risk became too high, and Paul and Mick had no choice but to call off the operation before pushing Tony for more details. In the meantime, Ellie's mother took a different approach. In 2021, she hired a lawyer in Mozambique, forcing the authorities to reopen the case. This move led to another major breakthrough. In May of 2023, Mozambique's authorities officially ruled Ellie's death as a homicide, not just in a police report but in a public statement. They even named potential suspects but claimed that the evidence was not strong enough to justify arrests. Then, in December of 2020, the Australian inquest into Ellie's death finally came to a close. The State Coroner of Victoria acknowledged that murder was a possibility, but stopped short of declaring it outright, citing a lack of definitive proof. This ruling ignored the weight of the evidence, the sand analysis, the inconsistencies at the crime scene, the eyewitness testimonies, and the fact that the sand found in Ellie's mouth did not match the location where she was discovered. Mozambique's authorities had already stated that Ellie had been killed, yet Australia refused to back their conclusion. The decision delivered a heavy blow to the case. Without Australia's support, it became even less likely that Mozambique would move forward with prosecutions. And, despite years of demands, the mutual assistance request, an essential step for international cooperation, remains unsigned. If Ellie were alive today, she would be a 28-year-old marine biologist, travelling the world and doing what she loved. Instead, her life was stolen, and those responsible still walk free. 9 years have passed, yet her government seems determined to let her case fade into the background. But Paul Warren refuses to let that happen. He continues to fight for justice, unwilling to let his daughter be forgotten. What do you think about Ellie Warren's case? Do you believe justice will ever be served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please consider subscribing to our channel, giving it a like, and sharing it with others who may be interested. Your support helps us continue bringing you important stories like this. Thank you for watching.